From wildfires to floods, extreme weather events have become more common around the world, and many rich countries are now feeling their devastating impacts. So will this lead to more action? And how can we prepare for the challenges ahead? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the program. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, as global temperatures have soared in recent decades, there's been a significant increase in the number of weather-related disasters. The UN is warning these extreme conditions are likely to continue and worsen if we don't take action. Now, at the moment, the northeastern United States is evaluating the destruction left behind by Hurricane Ida, which caused extensive damage from Louisiana to New York City. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this update from Kristen Salumi in New Jersey.
The Northeast woke up to flooded cities and impassable streets. Many had to be rescued as the remnants of Hurricane Ida made their way north more than 3 days after first making landfall thousands of kilometers away in Louisiana. There were even tornadoes, seeming to catch heavily populated big cities like Philadelphia off guard with record rainfall. Serious flooding caused the complete shutdown of the subway system. The New York borough of Queens suffered the most fatalities in the city, at least 12 residents dying as water flooded basement apartments. The first crisis for New York's new governor.
The human loss, which is hard to imagine, that people simply in their cars, in their homes, in their basements, succumb to the ravages of a brutal storm, and their families must just be in such pain this morning.
In New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy was out early Thursday visiting the town of Malika Hill, hit by those tornadoes, which left devastation normally associated with the southern United States. The ferocity of the storm took many by surprise, trapping families in basement apartments and motorists on roadways that quickly turned to rivers. More than 20 centimeters of rain fell overnight in some areas. That's as much as typically falls in the entire month of September.
When I stopped.
This man we spoke to in New Jersey had stopped in his truck to take a video
Look at this.
when water in the street suddenly began to rise.
The river. All of a sudden, I looked down the road, and literally it was like a river coming towards me. And me and my daughter, my 12-year-old, were with me, and we just panicked. I put it in four-wheel drive and just backed out real quick before it submerged my truck.
Northeastern governors and President Biden say the trail of destruction left by Ida is yet more evidence of climate change's impact on weather systems across the United States. And Biden says the country needs to prepare for more to come.
We need to act. When Congress returns this month, I'm going to press for their action on my Build Back Better plan. That's going to make historic investments in electrical infrastructure, modernizing our roads, bridges, our water systems.
For those left counting the cost of Ida's destruction, relief can't come soon enough. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New Jersey.
Well, the UN says weather-related disasters have increased fivefold in the past 50 years. Now, this year alone, record-breaking wildfires triggered by unprecedented heat waves have caused extensive damage in Europe, across Siberia and North America. The rise in global temperatures and the warming of oceans have also strengthened the intensity of tropical storms. And that's causing extreme rainfall and devastating flooding from China to Germany and now the US. But still, more than 90% of deaths related to weather disasters have occurred in developing nations. Madagascar has now endured 4 years of drought and is on the brink of the world's first climate-induced famine. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we have Michael Dorsey. He's a Planetary Emergency Partnership member and also a former member of the Environmental Protection Agency's National Advisory Committee. In Reading, in the UK, we have Richard Allen. He's a professor of climate science in the Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading, and also the co-lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that's just come out. And in New Delhi, Chandra Bhushan, CEO of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us today. I want to start with what we've seen over the last week. Now, Michael, as someone who's been involved with climate-related policy in the United States, I'm guessing that what we've seen, given the warnings around Hurricane Ida, the fires around Lake Tahoe, that none of this has come as any surprise to you. So what's your assessment of how it's all been dealt with?
Well, really, in the United States, the problem of the unfolding climate crisis has been dealt with absolutely poorly, particularly by both political sides. On the right, we have a sort of a policy denial, policy madness, no policy, no commitment. On the left, we've got a slow walkabout, but oftentimes in circles with not enough ambition. We've got, I think, the left is more perhaps characterized by what you might say is policy schizophrenia. Just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Blinken appointed as his top energy advisor an old hand from the oil and gas sector. Nothing could be more daft given this unfolding crisis. We've also got low ambition, though President Biden has put the United States back in the Paris Agreement. He put us in not in a more robust way. So we've really got to get ahead of this crisis in a way that's purpose and fit for scale. And if we don't, we're going to see more deaths, and they're going to be particularly concentrated on the poorest of society, those on the margins of society. Most of the people that died across the U.S. in these past few days were poor black and brown folks, folks living in basements that weren't fit for habitation and so forth. So we've got this policy incoherence that really damns those that are on the margins of society, unfortunately.
You mentioned some of the dozens of deaths that we saw there. Now, when I was trying to understand the destruction that Hurricane Ida wrought, I came across a graph that really struck me, and I want to bring it up for our viewers. It is around looking at the temperature, how the temperature of the oceans has really increased over the last century. I mean, that's a hugely, hugely significant jump. I know that scientists are saying warmer water will make hurricanes stronger, slower, and wetter. Richard, you were the lead author on the water cycles part of the IPCC report. Can you explain that phenomenon for us?
Yeah, so I mean, tropical cyclones like Ida are fueled by the energy in the upper layers of the ocean. So if the upper layers of the ocean is warming, that gives more power to the cyclone. But even more important to some of the impacts that we're seeing currently across the United States is the fact that there's more water in a warmer atmosphere. And that again can power the cyclone by releasing energy in the atmosphere, but also it powers the intensity of the rainfall. We've seen huge amounts of rain falling in a very short amount of time, and that leads to severe impacts. So the warming of climate due to humans is making the strongest cyclones stronger, but particularly it's making the rainfall heavier. And when there's coastal inundation, this is worse because sea levels are higher because of the warmer oceans and the melting of ice.
Well, I know South Asia, for instance, has also been experiencing intensified flooding, associated landslides with that. Over the last few months, though, as we've been talking about, really developed nations have been seeing some of the brunt of all of this. Floods in Western Europe, the heat wave in Canada, snow in Texas. Chandra, I know you've been working on these issues for years. Now that richer countries are feeling a bit more of the pain, do you think that will actually spur more action?
I hope so. So far it was all about poor countries and underdeveloped countries getting hit by extreme weather events, and no one cared. These things have been happening in my part of the world over the last decade and a half. I can very clearly remember in early 2000s, so we had devastating flood across South Asia. And this is happening every year, but so far it was all about poor developing countries with low resilience, and that could be, ignored. But what we have seen this year is that rich countries are not going to escape this devastation as well. What happened in Germany and Belgium was not poor people dying, actually. Middle class got affected. And the fire in California, which is raging right now, it is affecting rich house owners. So it is quite clear that climate change, even if you are a wealthy country, it is not going to spare you. It is going to devastate economies. It is going to destroy infrastructure, and it's going to kill people. So I think it is time that everyone realizes it and accepts this fact and start working together.
Well, let's take a look at what lies ahead for all of us as a world then. I know the IPCC expert report on climate change that just came out last month really summarizes quite a lot of this for policymakers. So let's look at a couple of quotes from that. Many changes in the climate system become larger in direct relation to increasing global warming. They include increases in the frequency and intensity of hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, agricultural and ecological droughts in some regions, and proportion of intense tropical cyclones, as well as reductions in Arctic sea ice, snow cover, and permafrost. That's quite a lot, but there's more. Continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variability, global monsoon precipitation, and the severity of wet and dry events. Richard, I know that you were the author who actually drafted that statement. And there is this call for the world to take immediate action to try to mitigate some of this. But looking at what's already locked into the system based on what we've already emitted, this phrase, inevitable, irreversible, what should we be bracing for, Richard?
Well, yeah, you're right. Some aspects are irreversible, but a lot of the extremes we're seeing at the moment can be limited with strong, rapid and sustained cuts in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So what we're seeing now is just the start, essentially. So if we let warming continue unchecked, then of course we're going to see these extreme rainfall events, the severity of droughts and wildfire events, the melting of ice intensify into the future. So it's clearly obvious from the science, which is outlined in the IPCC report, that there needs to be a limiting of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases to stop this further intensification.
Well, despite the warnings that we've been hearing from scientists like yourself, Richard, the speed and the intensity of these events seems to be catching governments, people, everyday people by surprise. Now, we've seen all of this very plainly over the last week in the US. Michael, how are people there getting it so wrong in terms of predicting what's going to happen?
So I don't think we're really getting it wrong. I think we really don't have a sufficiently robust response. And we see that in terms of the commitments to reduce emissions. It's the President Biden has certainly pointed the country in the right direction, but he's off the mark by about 50 or as much as 100%. Carbon neutrality is no longer the destination that we need to be pointing towards. Really, we've got to think about carbon negativity and really aggressively getting there and being on a pathway that rapidly reduces emissions. And also, we've got to get out of moving money, particularly federal money, subsidies, into the thing that's causing the problem. That's the fossil fuel sector. We don't have a plan in the United States to dial out of fossil fuels. It's absolutely ridiculous after decades and decades of reporting from Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and many others from many summits of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That there's absolutely no organized thinking at the federal government level to end fossil fuel subsidies. We've got to do much more in that way to check what's driving this problem, that's the fossil fuel sector, and then really ramp up really aggressively the way in which we reduce emissions. And if we don't do those two things, we're going to be stuck with this problem unfolding in more and more catastrophic ways through time.
Well, you're talking there about mitigating some of the emissions and some of the impacts of those emissions. But it does seem that we are at the moment on track to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by around 2030, if not the middle of this century. I mean, that's pretty terrifying. So much of preparing for extreme events, though, isn't just about evacuating people, the preparedness that we've been talking about, but about much deeper adaptation, especially when it comes to infrastructure and things like that. Now, I'm curious, Chandra, you're sitting there in South Asia. Do you see the political will at home to get this done?
Well, I don't see political will in South Asia, and I don't see political will across the world. The fact is that over the last 20 years, there hasn't been significant change in our energy mix across the world. Despite the fact that renewables are cheaper, renewable electricity is cheaper, 80% of our primary energy still comes from fossil fuels. The only difference is that some countries burn coal and others burn natural gas. Europe and US have moved to cheap natural gas and can very well claim that they are doing great, but unfortunately they are not. the fossil fuel addiction that is there in the developed world is also there in the developing world. Now, we have to make sure, and I want scientists to be much more upfront on this issue and say that let's get rid of fossil fuel over the next 20 to 30 years. Now, before this extreme weather events have hit US, the debate in the US was actually on oil prices. Biden administration wanted to lower oil prices. Okay, just few weeks back, that was the debate in the US. Now, if you have these kind of debates, then how are you going to solve climate crisis? Unfortunately, you're not going to solve climate crisis. So I think it is important that across the world, the political leadership understands that we should start talking about the end of fossil fuel era. If we are not talking about end of fossil fuel, we are not serious about climate change.
Well, let's throw this then to our resident scientist. Richard, so much of my understanding around this is around the unpredictability of events, right? So not being able to prepare for the extreme weather that potentially lies ahead. We now have, I believe, more data to do that, as well as looking at what happens when multiple extreme events happen all at once and how they're all linked. How reliably at the moment do you think, as a scientist, can we predict the future, especially given that there are some big potential tipping points that people have been speculating about that could change everything?
Yeah, well, so there are certainly a huge number of ways we can be better prepared. But first, just to pick up on your previous guest's point, which I completely agree with. And the IPCC report, the latest one, is clear, and it involves policymakers in the process of approving line by line the summary. And in it states that we cannot limit warming to below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial without these strong, rapid, sustained cuts in CO2. But not only that, getting down to net zero CO2 emissions, which essentially means any residual emissions of CO2 through burning of oil, gas or coal, or use of cement, has to be balanced out by sucking back carbon from the atmosphere in various ways by, for example, carbon capture and storage technologies, growing sustained forest, natural native forest, and these kind of aspects. So that's just to pick up on your last guest point. I totally agree. And this is laid down extremely clear in the IPCC report for policymakers. And for your first guest as well, so much more ambitious pledges are needed to achieve this. So I agree. And then moving on to your second point, which talks about preparedness. Some aspects, as you mentioned, are irreversible, and some aspects, like the extremes, we're going to be, even at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees above pre-industrial, we're going to see these intense extremes. We're going to have to adapt to some aspects of climate change. We can't avoid some of it. And so as we've seen in Germany, for example, there was quite in the summer, due to the flooding, there was a slightly patchy geographical range in how prepared local regions were. The warnings are there because you can make weather forecasts. They're pretty accurate out to 5 days these days, much more so than going back 10 years in the past, because we're able to use an array of observations to start the forecasts up. We have higher resolution computer simulations. So we're able to provide better preparedness in terms of forecasts and these kind of things. So better preparedness for ongoing droughts, flash droughts that start to form, wildfire, weather, which, hot, dry conditions, but also windy conditions, heavy and sustained rainfall falling on already wet catchments. All these things are quite well known, but there needs to be a lot more done to adapt to the climate change, to reduce the impact of these. And finally, the aspects of the climate system that are irreversible, one of these is sea level rise. Now, even if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial, we can expect over the very long term, say many hundreds of years, maybe up to 2,000 years, we can expect 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise. So you can imagine what that will do to coastal cities. And that's in the very long term. So that's a very long-term timescale, which we can adapt to, but it will still be a huge issue and existential, of course, for small island nations, which can't literally move above 3 meters. So all these aspects need both the mitigation to stop any further increases, because the IPCC report states that we can see a sea level rise of up to 22 meters in 2,000 years if warming spirals out to 5 degrees C.
Indeed.
So we need to
I do want
mitigate,
to
limit
bring
warming,
in Michael
and we
here
need
on
to
the
adapt
adaptation issue,
to
which I do want to dig into a little more. Michael, you served on the EPA Advisory Committee under President Barack Obama, I believe, and then you watched after that as President Trump took a vastly different approach, as you've alluded to already. Now, how can countries, cities, deal with trying to put policies in place to adapt to issues like this when different administrations take such different approaches?
Well, it's profoundly challenging. It's profoundly difficult for them to make adaptations, particularly when there's incoherence at the federal government. But I think this is really a challenge that is not only unique to the United States, but really it applies and plays out in many, many countries. You've got, incoherent policy making at the highest levels of government, at the federal level, whether that's in the US or whether it's in Brazil, whether it's across Europe, whether it's in India, you name it. This is place. But you also have a great number of folks at the municipal level really, really pushing hard, bringing in resources, rethinking, policies to mitigate and adapt to this unfolding crisis. And I think you're seeing some of this now. We heard it just the past few days with New York, where they said, look, we've got to get New York City, and certainly the rest of the state as well, but really better prepared to tackle and handle and deal with these, catastrophic weather events. And so I think there's hope at the municipal level, but it's going to be a constant battle when you have, basically leaders that are ultimately not fit for purpose, running countries and so forth.
When you say that there is hope for action, I want to turn to Chandra and something you mentioned earlier about the very rapidly decreasing cost of renewables. I was looking at the numbers, and the price of solar energy dropped 89% in just 10 years. I mean, that's massive. I wonder then, does it matter why countries actually take action? Could it be driven by bottom lines and a desire for more profit rather than a desire to try to save humanity? Does it matter why it happens as long as it happens? Could this all then be a cause for optimism?
At one hand, it is a cause for optimism because renewable costs are down, battery storage cost is going down, we have electric vehicle which is competing with internal combustion engine. All these are good news. But the bad news is last year, the world invested more in fossil fuels than in clean energy. So you have vast fossil fuel interest, which is thriving right now across the world. And there are reasons for it. There are countries who are completely dependent on oil revenues to survive, from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia. And then there are countries which are dependent on coal and gas. Russia, for example, is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So there is a vast fossil fuel interest that exists in the world. Now, how do you get rid of that interest and replace it with clean energy interest is going to be the biggest challenge. Now, on that front, I think it is also important to realize that while developed countries have resources, developing countries don't have that kind of resources. I think Michael talked about New York thinking about investing billions of dollars in adaptation. Unfortunately, municipalities in Bangladesh or India or countries in Africa don't have those kind of money. And one of the big thing we will have to do if we want this change to happen is to move money where it matters. Currently, the money is moving to all the dirty practices. We have to move it to adaptation, to clean energy, to building resilience in the society. Unless and until we are able to move the money, I think whatever we are talking about is very theoretical. It is not going to matter even in the short term, leave long term.
And we're going to have to see what happens at the climate talks that we are expecting in November in Glasgow. I do want to give Richard the last word here, because I'm curious, as a scientist, as someone who's been very close to the data on all of this and very involved in writing this latest IPCC report, how do you personally feel about where we are as a species? Do you have the confidence in our ability to make choices to save and protect ourselves? And I'm just going to ask you to respond to that very briefly, please, Richard.
Well, I think the science is clear, so we know what has to be done, as also mentioned by your other guests. And We are, I think, moving in the right direction, but far too slowly. So as you say, this upcoming meeting in Glasgow, the Glasgow COP26, is absolutely crucial for policymakers to really ramp up their ambition in terms of cutting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And there is so much on the line, indeed. Well, thank you to all of our guests joining us here today. Michael Dorsey, a Planetary Emergency Partnership member, Richard Allen, a professor of climate science at the University of Reading, and Chandra Bhushan, CEO of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And do remember, you can always join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Now, from me, Nastasia Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.